If you know anything about Canada, you're aware that housing is a top of mind subject for many Canadians. Reporters and pundits will use terms like housing shortage, cost of living crisis, and housing as a human right to frame the discussion. Some will cite the pandemic, supply chain issues, and other factors to explain the current situation. While they have indeed contributed to the rise in home prices and monthly rent, I found that the Canadian media rarely provides the full picture and a longer time frame to show the significant fluctuations. To only compare 12 months seems insufficient, so I decided to analyze the cost of living in Canada from 2015 to 2024. This is part one of Canada's Economy under Trudeau, a weekly series during Canada's 2025 federal election. To get the latest updates, please subscribe to me at Sidock on YouTube and click the notifications button to be alerted when I post new videos. As you can see, I've picked 3 dates as reference points for this specific table: January 2015, January 2019, and January 2024. I did this for a specific reason. I wanted to get a point of comparison before Trudeau came into office, so that's in 2015. In 2019, I wanted to get a point of reference before the pandemic started. And then in January 2024, it's more or less where we are now. As a general trend, you could see that the prices have clearly increased for each city and for the national average. So we'll break it down in the next table. However, I did want to point out one specific thing for Halifax, because in 2019, rental prices exploded in the city with an all-time low of a vacancy rate of 1.6%. The reason I mention this is because the pent-up demand may have contributed to the relatively high increase in house prices from 2019 to January 2024. It'll be more obvious once we get to the rental section. However, as we move on to the next table, you'll see that it may have had an impact on the home prices as well. Let's examine absolute increases in home prices. I broke it down into 2 periods, from 2015 to 2019 and 2019 to 2024. Let's call them first and second period to keep things simple. Now, there's a general trend here, which is that the second period is larger than the first period for all of the cities listed here. However, the distribution is not the same for each city. Halifax is the most extreme example because home prices only increased by 34,000 during the first period, and in the second period, it increased by 234,000. So clearly there's a massive difference there, especially compared to other cities. So if we take Vancouver as an example, it's only a $41,000 difference. And I know it sounds crazy to say that, but the increase in the second period is relatively closer when you look at other cities as an example. So let's move on to something that may be more useful in some ways, and definitely easier to understand, which is the percentages. Here are the percentage increases in home prices. What you may not have expected is that the percentages be as close as they are in this graph. For example, Vancouver shows a higher percentage in the first period than in the second one, despite the fact that the absolute numbers increase more in the second period. So I know this is a bit confusing, but it's important to keep in mind that you have to know what the basis of comparison is. And I found that in some of the reporting, it's a bit misleading because they only talk about a 12-month period. That is to say, if you're looking at home prices in 2015 and only comparing it to 2024, that'll give you a number. Let's say it's 3%. But that number doesn't take into account all of the previous years and explain it in a meaningful way, which is why I'm showing you a number of different tables and why the next one will be useful as well. For example, in Montreal, the absolute numbers increased almost 3 times in the second period when compared to the first one. But here you see only 22% versus 52%. So let's move on to the next table and you'll see what I'm trying to explain. This is the most important table when it comes to home prices from 2015 to 2024, because you could see both the absolute change and the percentage change. So that means that you could say throughout Canada, on average, home prices increased by $309,000 or 75%. For certain cities, that percentage was even higher. Toronto, it was almost double at 95, and Halifax at 105,000. However, it's important to consider the starting price because in Vancouver, although the percentage is lower, home prices still increased by $459,000. So let's move on to the next section because when you start examining the rents and then comparing it to home prices, you'll see a few interesting trends. So let's get into it. It's time to talk about renting in Canada. You'll notice that I use the same 5 cities and the national average to be able to compare a little bit with the home prices. I use 3 time periods, with the only difference being that the information is taken from April 2015 rather than January 2015. That's just what the CMHC had available at the time. And for all of these tables, I'm using a 2 bedroom apartment as a point of reference. I'll also highlight that for Halifax, 2019 was an important year in terms of rental prices. As I mentioned before, the vacancy rate was 1.6%, which is exceptionally low. And there was a big difference between January 2019 and December 2019. So, starting in April 2015, the average 2 bedroom apartment was a little over $1,000. By January 2019, that had risen to $1,363, which is an increase of about $300 and not much compared to the other cities. However, by December 2019, the monthly rent for an apartment was $1,948, which is almost doubled when comparing to 2015. I just wanted to mention that it'll be useful in the upcoming tables. However, I just want to keep in mind, I want you to keep in mind as well, that for a monthly rent, it's easier to budget because you know how much you pay for your expenses every month. And it's a bit easier to conceive because ultimately, even if you own a home, you do have bills to pay every month. So just keep that in mind as we go on to the second table of rental prices. We're now looking at absolute increases in rent. We'll use the term first and second period once again. What you'll notice here is that the trend is the opposite when compared to home prices. So you'll notice that in the first period, for every city except for Halifax, the increase was higher than in the second period. So nationally, apartments increased in rents by $815 in the first period, but only by $484 in the second period. Now, those numbers are closer for certain cities like Vancouver, where the difference is less than $100. But if you look at Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal, there's actually a pretty significant difference in terms of how much rents increased during the first 4 years that Trudeau was in office. The reason I mention this is that a lot of analysts in Canada will point to the fact that the pandemic had a huge effect on the cost of living in Canada, which is true. However, I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of the increases in rent happened before the pandemic was even a thought. So it's worth noting that for people who can't afford homes, for various reasons, but some of the demographics that come to mind are younger Canadians, new Canadians, older Canadians, and just overall people who are not as financially well off. People who rent generally do it because they have to do so. So they're more subject to the fluctuations in rent prices as opposed to how much home prices will impact their life. We're now looking at percentage increases in rent. Using the same terms, you'll notice that the first period has a much higher percentage than the second period for every city except for Halifax. And if we use December 2019 instead of January 2019 for Halifax, that 32% goes up to 88%. So, worth mentioning. My point here is that before the pandemic even started, there was a massive increase in rent prices. So if you look at cities like Toronto and Montreal, it more than doubled in that period. And even if you look at something like the national average, 86% is massive. It's almost doubled during that period. But during the second one, it only increased by 27%, which relatively speaking is not a lot. We're now looking at the most important table in terms of renting in Canada from 2015 to 2024. For each city shown here, there was a massive increase in terms of both percentage and absolute numbers. So, nationally, we could say that the average two-bedroom apartment in Canada went up 137% or $1,299. For the biggest cities like Vancouver and Toronto, and to a lesser extent, Montreal, there was a massive increase in absolute numbers. But in every case, it went up more than the average percentage in Canada. So even though there's a higher number for Montreal in terms of percentage, which is 203% or slightly above tripling during that time, the increase was much bigger in Vancouver, where it only went up 172% or $2,315. It's kind of mind blowing to look at these numbers. And I think it's especially useful when you're comparing what happened to renters in Canada as opposed to homeowners. So let's move on to the final table of this video. Here are the percentage increases for both home prices and rent for a two-bedroom apartment in Canada from 2015 to 2024. You'll notice a few differences between both categories because rent increased much more as a percentage than home prices in Canada. Nationally, rent increased by 137%, whereas home prices increased by only 75%. That's almost double. And when you look at cities like Vancouver or Montreal, you could see that that gap is even bigger. One question to ask is who benefits from these higher prices? Clearly, if you are already a homeowner, you benefit from an increase in the value of your home. But people who are, in most cases, less financially successful have to rent, so they are more affected by these prices. It's also worth noting when those price increases happened. For renting, the biggest increases were in that first period from 2015 to 2019. So it didn't have anything to do with the pandemic. However, home prices increased a lot more in that second period from 2019 to 2024. While the cost of living increased in Canada during the pandemic, it doesn't provide a full picture of why inflation is such an issue in the country. From 2015 to 2019, rent increased much more than from 2019 to 2024. This goes against the explanation that everything can be attributed to the pandemic and the uncertainty regarding it. This is part one of Canada's Economy under Trudeau, a weekly series during Canada's 2025 federal election. Please subscribe to my videos to find the next parts as I describe what happened in the economy over the past 9 years.